Now thrive the Armourers. Hello, I'm Guy Wilson, and Liveryman K. Smith and I are your guides through the 700 years of the Armourers and Brasiers Company.
At the turn of the 20th century, the country seemed very settled. Queen Victoria's long reign finally came to an end with her death in 1901. She was succeeded by her son, Edward VII, but the long imperial era of wealth and prosperity seemed destined to continue indefinitely. Cathy Ross, former curator at the Museum of London, describes the Edwardian city.
Well, around 1900 and in the Edwardian period, London was a very complacent city. It had expanded, got far more wealthy during the late Victorian period, and was very much the capital of world finance and the capital of the largest empire that the world had ever seen. So it was very pleased with itself. A lot of new buildings went on, grand new imperial schemes in the city. We have the Port of London Authority building, which was built to an enormous scale and really epitomised the triumph of the British Empire.
However, all was not as it seemed on the surface. Dark undercurrents were at play across Europe, which led unexpectedly to a terrible world war.
But the complacency of London was rather punctured by the First World War. Not only was it an enormous shock to the system, as it would have been for any society, but London also started to experience aerial bombing for the first time. At that period, of course, it was bombing from Zeppelins and nothing like the Blitz that occurred during the Second World War. But nevertheless, it affected everybody and began to really make London think about the future and how fragile this great empire was.
Strangely, this terrible conflict did not affect members of the company very much at all. Only 2 members perished, and both of those in the dreadful influenza epidemic which swept the world in the wake of the war. It is worth remembering that most members at that time were elderly and were either too old to serve or were given desk jobs at home.
After the war, the company got back to life as usual, but not everything was the same. The conflict had many consequences. One of them was that economic turmoil meant that many great collections of arms and armour came onto the market, and as a result the company managed to acquire considerable quantities of armour, as Tom Richardson, former curator of armour at the Royal Armouries, explains.
Under the influence of people like Graham, the long-time surveyor for the company, and the men from the Tower, Viscount Dillon and his protégé Charles Fawkes, both of whom were invited to become honorary members of the company began to collect by purchase. And it was a time when many of the great collections that had been formed in the 19th century were coming on the market. So the collection includes pieces from Seymour Lucas's collection, the Brett collection, the Lonsborough collection, the Warwall collection, many of the great collections that are known from 19th century England. Another great collection which came on the market in the 1920s was the Pembroke collection from Wilton House, which had belonged since the time of its use to the Earls of Pembroke, and that was one of the largest and most prestigious collections, especially of 16th century armour, ever to hit the English auction market, and there are many fine examples from the Pembroke collection in the Armourers Hall today.
Building on its initiative in the previous century, the company started to take a far greater part in education and training, particularly in trade skills. Mike Goulet, a retired director of Rolls-Royce and a former master of the company, explains.
So in 1878, the company, along with a number of other trade-related livery companies, got together with the Corporation of London to form the City and Guilds Institute. And this was about training in trades, training in skills for people who were going to go into a trade of various sorts. And ultimately, the City and Guilds Institute, which was the thing that was founded then, became part of Imperial College. At the same time, some members of the company had links to the Royal School of Mines, which was the leading institute teaching metallurgy back in those days. And the Royal School of Mines also became part of Imperial College, which is how the relationship between the company and Imperial College really started.
Company life continued as before. In 1928, the company found itself needing a new beadle, and the Westminster Gazette reported on the search for a replacement. The job advert set out some of the attributes needed.
A stentorian voice, a dignified and imposing mien, unlimited tact, and a few Falstaffian virtues. These are the qualifications for the post of Beadle to the Worshipful Company of Armourers and Brasiers, which has just fallen vacant. We have had over 50 applications already, an official at the Armourers Hall EC told the Westminster Gazette yesterday. All sorts of people, from ex-captains downwards, have applied. The salary is £200 and attendance is not often required. It seems to appeal to a lot of people as a sort of congenial part-time job.
In the aftermath of the First World War, the company took a more active role in the field of metallurgy, as Mike Goulet explains.
So later on in the 1920s, the company was actually supporting research in aeronautics because following the end of the First World War, there was not a lot of money around, and actually finding money and support for aeronautics was quite difficult. And the company recognised that this was something that was going to be a key part of the future. Also had a relationship, obviously, to metallurgy and the working of metals, which is important for aeronautics. And so the company supported some fellowships in that area.
In the 1930s, it was decided that, alongside its growing links with training in metallurgy, the company should make more of a display of its ancient trade and expand the displays of arms and armour on the walls of the livery hall. Here's Tom Richardson again.
The idea of display of armour, too, was influenced principally by Charles Foulkes, who was experienced in displaying the National Collection at the Tower, and it's to him that we owe the concept of the display of armour that we see in the hall today.
The company was also actively developing its links with the new science of metallurgy. Here's Mike again.
So between the First World War and the Second World War, the company got together with the Royal Society to give fellowships in the emerging science of metallurgy, which is obviously very important and goes back to the origins of the company.
Between the wars, the City of London was changing, as Cathy Ross again explains.
During the 1930s, the city had become even more of a sort of office monoculture. Trading was still going on, the empire was at its height, now it was rebranded as the British Commonwealth rather than the empire, but a lot of trade and commerce going on in the city.
But then came the Second World War.
The Second World War obviously brings that to an end and forms an immense watershed for the city when there was a great exodus of people from London as bombing started and families moved to the countryside. So London's population really does plummet during the Second World War because of the aerial bombing. And at the height of the Blitz, bombs rained down on the city, leaving a landscape of desolation and destruction.
Although some 6 members lost their lives, the company came through the conflict relatively unscathed. Just. But as during the Great Fire of London in 1666, the hall came very close to destruction. Roger Bowdler, architectural historian and presently master of the company, takes up the story.
On the night of the 29th of December 1940, London suffered a devastating air raid, known from that famous photograph of St Paul's Cathedral surviving above the billowing clouds of smoke. And the hall was actually hit by an incendiary bomb, and a fire took light within the hall. Curtains were blazing. Luckily enough, a fireman was passing. He saw that fire was taking hold inside the hall, broke into the building and extinguished the fire. We don't know his name, alas, because he saved the hall from likely destruction. And he is honoured with a cartouche in the livery hall, which simply says, "The Unknown Fireman, 1940, which I think is an extremely fitting tribute to a very narrow escape.
The Second World War proved a watershed in more ways than one. Just before it, members still dined in a warm glow of imperial affluence. The menu for the 20th of April in 1939 included
oysters, clear turtle soup, salmon with mousseline sauce, whitebait, mousse of foie gras and tongue, saddle of lamb with creamed spinach and new potatoes, asparagus, roast duckling and peas, Westmoreland ham with pine and lettuce salad, passion fruit iced soufflé with chocolate wafer biscuits, devilled lobster, dessert, fruit-shaped ices with wafers and coffee, all washed down with the best Montrachet wine, along with Madeira, sherry, hock, champagne, burgundy, claret, port and brandy.
However, after the war, things were very different. Dinner on the 11th of December 1945 consisted only of
soup, fish, cold goose with vegetables, anchovy eggs and coffee accompanied by hock, claret, champagne, port and brandy.
But one thing remained the same. At both dinners, the claret was Chateau Latour. The 1924 vintage in 1939, the 1929 vintage in 1945.
In many other ways, too, the Second World War proved a watershed for the company, and since then it has gradually developed into what we know today, a well-established, vibrant and active organisation. Key to the smooth running of the company is the clerk. Peter Bateman, our former clerk, explains what the role entails.
Well, the basic role and responsibilities of the clerk to a livery company are as follows. Essentially, the clerk is the chief executive of the company. He is an employee, and it's his job to work with the master and the wardens and the court to ensure proper administration and the smooth running of the company's affairs.
The clerk's role is pivotal in the smooth running of the company, as it provides the essential continuity and experience. The master, who is only in post for a year, cannot know all the intricacies of its administration, as Mike Goulet explains.
Becoming the master of a livery company like the Armourers Brasiers is a bizarre and exciting experience. When one joins the court, you know very little about the way that the company operates. As a liveryman, you see your peers a few times a year, but you really get no feel for how the company operates. And I think one of the things the company does well is to train you up as you come through the court, to learn about how the company operates and also learn about what it might be like to be master. And it is a real privilege to be master, to be in charge for 1 year of this wonderful institution that goes back 700 years is both daunting but also very exciting. And the thing you don't quite realise, even when you're coming up through the court and you're being trained, as it were, is just how busy and how intensive that year is. The number of companies that we interact with, that we go to lunches and dinners and we go to visit their halls out of town in Bristol and in York, is vast, and you meet some amazing and fascinating people.
The master's year is very busy and full of hard work, but it has its compensations.
One of the things I did very shortly after I became master was to be invited to go to the Army Training Centre at Sandhurst, where they were having a STEM day, Science, Technology, Engineering and Mathematics Day for school children. And the huge parade ground at Sandhurst was covered with army vehicles, helicopters, goodness knows what. And then all around were booths that were set up by the suppliers to the army. And there were literally thousands of school kids having an absolutely fascinating time. And it's that sort of thing which in normal life you would never ever get a chance to do that really makes being a master very special.
But if the master is essentially outward-looking, others look after the interests of the members, as Peter Bateman makes clear.
It's also important to maintain relationships with our members. Originally, the beadle was probably the most important member of the company, in that most of the company members would work or live, or both, within 5 minutes' walk of the hall. And the beadle with his staff would take it upon himself, as necessary, to round up the members, and he would sort of shepherd them to the hall for meetings. Over the centuries, as the company grew and as society changed and as membership amortised out beyond the City of London, beyond London itself, and indeed with members living in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, wherever, obviously a beadle is not in a position to do that. So the clerk's role became ever more important as the person charged with communicating with members and letting them know what's going on in the company and what the company expected of them. And that's where the new IT, the emails, the website, the customer relationships management tool are starting to bear fruit. But we're still developing those.
While charitable giving has been a major part of the company's purpose since its foundation in the 14th century, it was given a major boost with the creation of the Gauntlet Trust. Anne-Marie Clift, the Trust's chief executive, explains.
So the Gauntlet Trust was created in 1979 to bring together the accumulated charitable funds of the company going back many centuries. And at that time, it developed a clear charitable purpose to support the material science community, which was seen as the academic area for research and education, which was most closely aligned to the armourer's ancient craft of working with metals.
To further this work and provide a structured focus, another change was required, as Mike explains.
So in 1986, the company decided that it would form what was then called the Metals Committee to oversee all the work that it was doing around supporting metals and metallurgy. And there were three key people involved in that. There was Bob Perrin, who was the father of our past master Nicky Davis, Stephen Flood, and John Horn, who was always known as Trader Horn. And those three are really critical in the formation of today's activities around material science, because they really drove the company in the direction of formalising and structuring the way that the company related to material science and ultimately materials technology.
The late 20th century also saw a revival of a very important company tradition, the active participation of women. In the first 4 centuries of the company's existence, women had played an important role in the life of the company, but this lapsed in the final decades of the 17th century. Happily, since the 1980s, there has been a rapid revival in the role of women in the company's affairs. Nicky Davis, our First Lady Master, tells her story.
I joined the company through patrimony. My father himself was an apprentice. He was apprenticed in the 1930s to Stacey Hadfield. And at the end of the war, my father took up his freedom and progressed through the company and ultimately became master in 1985. Women were allowed to join as freemen in 1988, and it was at that point that I joined the company, and I became one of the first ladies on the livery and the first lady to join the court. And it's been a great privilege to be the First Lady Master.
Thus, by the end of the 20th century, the company had once more become inclusive. It had forged close links with industry and education. It had modernised and improved its management. And as the new millennium dawned, the company seemed well set to ward off future threats and take advantage of new opportunities.
Next time, a new millennium with all its opportunities. But what are we making of them? What will we make of them? This has been a Past Master production for Basilisco Press. Our thanks to Peter Bateman, Roger Bowdler, Anne-Marie Clift, Nicky Davis, Mike Gillette, Tom Richardson and Cathy Ross.